Let's see. So you should find us on any of our typical 5 spots. And I'll start getting the links up. Where am I? Here. Twitch, Tweaker, iFace. Oh, I wanted to keep out of Zoom. Damn it. I'm going to be moving forward the conversation on that $33 million dude in Florida.
Which $33 million dude?
There's a guy who called me from one of my letters. He's got a 119 unit in Florida. And he said, I'm interested in selling, but if you offer me $1 less than 33 million, don't even call me back.
Right.
And that includes the real estate. And so I'm still learning how to deal with the fact of like, okay, what's this real estate worth? And he gave me some basic numbers. Presumably they're correct. I mean, I got to look at the
120 units
Yes.
for 33 million. Is he living in like a $32 million property or what?
Well, it's looking like about a $20 million property because he said his EBITDA is somewhere around 2.4 million, which if we go to the 3 to 5 times EBITDA purchase price, if I lean on the far end of that at 5 times, that puts us at about a $12 million valuation of the business, and which would put a $21 million valuation of the property. And he's got an $18 million assumable loan, meaning he could just give me the loan on the real estate, the mortgage. So that's one of the reasons I'm like, okay, let me think about this. So I talked to someone who's involved in a real estate investment group in Florida, ironically enough, and I'm like, tell me what makes a piece of real estate attractive, because in order for me to figure out whether or not this is a deal, I've got to sell this real estate to somebody else, and in order for me to sell it to somebody else, I have to figure out how much rent I would need to pay to make this attractive, and depending on how much rent I would need to pay is going to affect whether or not the business is a deal. So on the quick preliminary that I've done, it's not for sure a deal, but it looks like we're in the right ballpark. So I'm gonna move on to the next step to see if I can get financials from him.
Okay.
Because wouldn't that be fucking cool? A $33 million deal. I mean, it's kind of a $12 million deal for the business aspect, but still, that's significantly bigger than my first one.
Okay.
Then I got to be in Florida all the time.
Yay.
Let's see. Tweaker. Link. Facebook link. We always get one guy watching Twitch, and I'm pretty sure it's a fucking spam bot. Oh, did you check our audio on one of the streams yet?
No.
Before I send out the links, let's do that. Oh, did you check our audio?
Sounds good.
Let's hear you talking too. I'll shut up. Go on one of the streams yet?
No.
Before I send out the links, let's do that. Well, did you check our audio?
Sounds good.
Let's hear you talking too. I'll shut up. That sounds good.
Go on one of the streams yet?
Yep.
Good. Okay. I can spell spontaneous. Come on. The spontaneous death of globalism. When I was in Austria, one of the guys I was staying with thought it was super duper hilarious that when you learn English in school that you have spelling tests for your own native language.
They have that too. What's he talking about?
I don't know. He's kind of a weird guy. He was a blacksmith.
So yeah, maybe he never went to school.
Okay, sharing this around. I got it on Twitter. I got it on Gab. Maximize this so it doesn't look so bad. Okay. Alright, we need the bathroom. And I'll be right back. Okay, I'm gonna restart. Very good. All right. Is you is or is you ain't ready?
As ready.
Here we go.
We'll do it live. Okay. We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live.
Hello, this is Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of IridaTV coming to you today. We're doing it live. Excuse me. It's December 27th, 2022. We're near the end of the year. And today we wanted to talk about something that I think everybody's going to find fascinating, which is the spontaneous death of globalism. How could that be the case, you say? Well, if you've listened to this show for any amount of time, or if you haven't, we recommend going back and listening to our critique of the evolution of civilizations. You'll know that we are big fans of a man by the name of Carroll Quigley and his writings. And unfortunately for us, Carroll Quigley died in like the 70s, and his most recent books are from the 60s. And so he gives these very colorful details and interpretations of all sorts of things going on Earth. And then suddenly at like 1968, which is the most recent book that I have from him, he's gone. And so we've actually had several conversations on the show of trying to interpret forward, kind of using the Quigley-esque mindset of like, what's going on today? And Nima somewhat recently actually discovered a guy and then shared it over to me that I'm not saying he's like the reincarnation of Quigley or something, but he's kind of filling that role that me and Nima have been looking for. So Nima's holding up one of his books. So this is Peter Zeihan, and Zeihan is spelled Zeihan, and the book is The End of the World is Just the Beginning.
Correct. Yeah.
So, if this is brand new information to you, get ready for a wild ride. So Nima's been reading the book, and I've been watching all sorts of this guy's talks. Apparently, Peter Zeihan is I think he refers to himself as a gister, where basically he accumulates data from every source, and then people hire him out for consulting to tell them what's going on the world. And because his unique capacity is that he considers himself a generalist, which is to say he doesn't focus on any specific thing, and he doesn't fall in love with any specific set of data. He just says, here's the big deal. And the big thing that he crosses over is geopolitics and demographics. Does that sound boring? Yes, but it's about to get really exciting. So, Nima, where do you think is the best way to open this? I think it's a description of globalism as we're going to be describing it here. It's going to be a little bit different from the conspiracy theory tinfoil hat version of globalism that we're normally talking about. But what globalism is, how it really started, and why it's about to get flushed down the toilet. Do you think that's a good place to start?
Mm-hmm.
So
maybe some. I don't know if we can tie in some Quigley and real big picture.
I think we can.
And then where does this fall in?
Go for it.
Well, so the big picture, the Quigley's big picture from evolution of civilizations is every civilization goes through 7 phases, and those phases are mixture, gestation, expansion, conflict,
Universal empire,
decay, and invasion. So I just counted on my hands. That was 7. I memorized all of them. So he analyzes dozens, I think a dozen or more of civilizations throughout history to test his theory, and it checks out pretty good. And his main topic, obviously, in Tragedy and Hope, ends up being Western civilization. But the methodology he applies to analyze Western civilization is from the evolution of civilizations, which is rarely ever discussed. Everyone always talks about the Anglo-American establishment, Tragedy and Hope, but I haven't really seen a lot of interest for the actual methodology behind those 2 books.
Right, which I think is much more fascinating. I mean, that's the most fascinating part of the whole thing.
Well, right. It's like it gives you the manual, and now it's, oh, that's what you're doing. So when you read Tragedy and Hope, you say, oh, that's what you're doing there. You're
Right.
going through that methodology. You didn't tell me. I mean, he doesn't really go into the method in Tragedy and Hope very much. He just
Kind of
goes
assumes
into
you know it.
Right. But so the big picture of that method is that civilizations have gone through these phases. After phase 3, which is conflict, there's phase 4, which is conflict. There's an opportunity to resume expansion, or you end up moving forward into a universal empire, and then from there on, there's no going back from decay and ultimate invasion of your country or of your civilization. So Western civilization is the mixture of Western civilization begins sometime in 400, starting 468
Yeah.
AD,
Yeah.
when Western Rome gets sacked, and Europe is splintered into a bunch of fiefdoms and kingdoms and archdoms and dukedoms, or whatever these things are.
Well, archdom, dukedoms, and on the same time, bishoprics and abbeys and monasteries and this sort of stuff. Yes.
Right. So then the mixture of different cultures, in particular German, Italian, and French, the German part of which they've never really been exposed to the sphere of Rome as much as obviously the Italians and the French. But these cultures start to mix and mingle, and that's the beginning of Western civilization. And the mixture begins in, I guess, 460. It goes into gestation, which basically means the groundwork is laid for people to work together on expanding your
Well,
civilization.
and then I think also creating the new culture, right? Because we had the old culture in Rome, which was the Roman gods and the structure that they had, and then we had the Germanic tribes of the north, and the French are kind of also Germanic tribes of the north at this point in time, right? And then they mix together. We've got a new religion. The old military structure doesn't work anymore. The old economic structure doesn't work anymore. The old intellectual structure doesn't. All these structures don't work anymore. And so you've got the old Roman one mixing with the new Germanic one, and the gestation period is, okay, this is turning into something concrete. This is turning into something new. Yeah.
And so Quigley's definition of a civilization is a producing society with an instrument of expansion. This instrument of expansion starts manifesting in phase 3, which is the phase of expansion. So what does this mean? I guess we should probably also go into the different spheres of culture that Quigley identifies, which are basically any society sets up institutions, or rather instruments, to solve problems, and these instruments can fall within 6 general gradations or areas, which is going from more concrete to less concrete: military, political, economic, social, ecclesiastical,
Or
and
religious. Yeah.
religious,
Yeah.
and intellectual. So also interesting, these are basically these are the 6 categories that try to satisfy our needs in the world. I guess it's the 6 industries or areas of interest that people have some kind of desire to learn more
the
about,
need for
utilize.
security, the need for organization, the need for wealth, the need for psychological certainty,
Right.
all these sorts of things. Yes,
Right. So with military, the need for security; politics, the need for
I'd say organization.
organization, clarity on the interpersonal power relationships. Economics is who gets what.
The need for
stuff.
material goods. Yes.
Social is the need for companionship, and then religious is the understanding of where we're going, where we come
Quigley
from.
says the need for psychological certainty.
Psychological certainty. And 6, intellectual, which is science, basically the pursuit of knowledge in the natural of knowledge about the natural world. And a military could be is obviously like a soldier, or a garrison is part of the military sphere, and a government is part of the political sphere, and
A priesthood
a
is part
bank,
of the religious sphere. Yeah.
priest is religious. So when a society is a producing society, that means that they may be growing food, but they just consume all that food that's grown. So they're basically treading water. They're not growing. So as a producing society becomes a civilization when they implement an instrument of expansion. And what's an instrument of expansion require? It requires three things: a savings, investment.
No, surplus was the first one.
Yeah, surplus, invention, and investment. So what do we mean by surplus? We mean that, for example, we produce more food than we can all eat. So some of the food is available to
Save and be invested.
to feed people who can work on some machinery or some ox cart that's better, or some things that make your output per worker
They could invest
greater.
in infrastructure or capital,
Yeah,
to put it in modern
yeah.
terms. Yes.
Yeah. So I just always get a little geek out on this, because
Me too.
so the important aspect of the savings is, in my opinion, it's really that you have a group of people that has stuff that some other group of people wants and doesn't have. Because otherwise, how do you excite someone to join your investment? I want to build a machinery, and I want to build a well, I want to build a road. What do they get out of it?
Well, let's give
Well,
some
if you-
concrete examples of that. I mean, let's go back to the Sumerian priesthood, right? As Quigley describes it, and I don't know if new data has been found out since the '60s on how exactly the Sumerian priesthood worked, but as Quigley described it, the priesthood gets a monopoly on the knowledge of when the floods are going to come from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, so they're able to warn people to say, hey, you got to get out of the delta before it floods and it kills you all. Instead of telling everybody how that works, they occult and keep the knowledge to themselves. And they say, oh, we're talking with the gods in order to figure it out, when in reality they just had a mathematical formula that averaged each year to get a more and more accurate picture. And they said, okay, you people need to give us offerings so we can communicate to the gods, so we can tell you when the floods are going to occur, right? And then as the people brought the offerings, the priesthood is able to accumulate the surplus, presumably of food, probably, right? But I'm sure there's tools and
Gold. I mean, they gave offerings in gold.
Okay.
Also.
Whatever was the thing that was needed, then because the priesthood has the surplus, they could turn around and say, you know what? Let's utilize this surplus to pay people to build irrigation, for example.
We just got
Right.
a question. The various stages of the methods are organized in a specific order, I assume. It must follow a specific pattern. He's asking.
This is Zamorano. Are you
Yeah.
referring to the 7 stages of civilization, or are you referring to the we'll call it the gamut of the way that society is broken up when Nima was
those are
saying
two
like the
different-
political, the military, and so forth.
Right. The culture analysis is the latter of what you were just pointing out. It's basically observing a given society at this moment. So any given moment, society will be engaging in these 6 spheres, and through time they will march. So the latter.
What?
No, they.
I'm sorry, Nima, go first. I do have something to say on it.
Well, it doesn't have to be organized in a specific order. Sometimes these things spring into existence out of necessity. For example, you have a tribe that's unarmed, and your tribe gets attacked by an armed tribe. Now you realize, oh my God, we have to have these weapons. So we have to create a military to protect our tribe.
Well, and then
So then, spring into existence springs an instrument of self-defense, which is a tribal military, I guess, in this case. Sorry.
well, and then
go ahead.
Quigley even points out, or he has these charts. Nima, do you have tragedy and hope within when reaching distance? I have it over there, but
Yeah.
I got to get up. So, near the beginning, when he's kind of breaking down these ideas, the tome, he'll actually rate a civilization on a given time, and these are all approximate to say, okay, on each of these 6 things that he has arbitrarily divided it into. He does emphasize this, that these divisions are completely arbitrary, where we could group them more, or we can cut them up into more detail as we need. And for the sake of how he's doing his analysis, he was comfortable using these 6 different divisions. But
Right.
when you look at these 6 divisions and put it on a chart, you can say, okay, how developed is a particular civilization at a particular time in each of these 6 divisions? And I mean, I think he had at some point there he's got like a modern Western civilization, for example, we're super developed intellectually. Is that it right there?
But that's what I'm asking you. Is that what you're referring to?
No, that looks like the demographic graph.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a demographic cycle.
For example, we're very, very developed intellectually, like on the scientific level, but we're very, very backwards right now on the religious level, right? Because, I mean, we're all fucking nihilists and atheists at this point.
Yeah.
Which is...
Right.
But and then go back 1,000 years, maybe we're backward intellectually, but we're way up on the religious level because, everybody's Catholic or whatever, right?
So yeah, I think that answered this question because you said, okay, that was exactly my doubt. It's adaptable. Yeah, it's not. There's no CEO of the 6 divisions of society that ordains how society exactly be structured. In most cases, obviously, you may have some really command top-down societies where it's all planned. But generally speaking, these things emerge in the course of the development of civilizations out of necessity. Out of need. This is what people. These are the things that people want, right? Safety. Oh my God, I'm scared. I want safety. Who has power over me? Politics. I want stuff, material. I want friends and love. The social companionship. These are basically the things. I think these are. I would call them the nodes of, or the spheres of power, because these are things that people will grab a hold of to have power over society, to be able to offer something that they want and that they need, so it becomes conditional then in some cases.
Well, and then I guess
I give you,
either it can spontaneously arise, or we identify, oh hey, we're lacking in this thing, and now that we understand this, we can consciously do something about it.
Right.
Yeah.
So these things spring into existence as instruments, as Carol Quigley called them. So we have a spontaneous military that's an instrument. It's there to defend you. But these instruments, through time, turn into institutions. And what he means by that is the group, the organization starts serving its own aggrandizement and its own personal individual goals rather than the originally stated goals, right? So you start going from a military that defends you from attackers to a military that has to have permanent standing armies and drills and rituals, and the horses need to be fed.
And making sure that the soldiers get paid, and making sure that you impress politicians, and then we can go one step further to say, hey, got to make sure that we're constantly at war. There's no reason to keep a standing army and have a, blah, 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 that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So in this case, this example also, for example, the instrument turns against its own purpose, right? Because people are supposed to be safe, but now the army wants to make war in order to retain its relevance and aggrandize its position. And he says perfect example and realistic, because it happens to be happening all the time.
Well,
so these things happen with every instrument that pops up.
Every social organization. And
every social organization.
Yeah, I want to emphasize this, is that Quigley points out that there's a natural reason for this happening. And if I remember that off the top of my head, the first one is that within an organization, if an organization has a purpose, we'll stick with the Army. The purpose of the Army is to provide security and protect the nation. So there's the first reason that institutionalization happens is that there's no person, singular person in the Army whose job it is to achieve the goal. Their job is to make sure these guys get fed, or to move vehicles around, or to oh, that didn't work at all. Damn it. Okay, or to sorry, I set something up to work really fancy, and it just didn't work, and I'm kind of kicking myself for it and trying to keep up midstream here. So yeah, everybody has an individual job, and none of them is make sure that the goal of the organization continues to be the goal of the organization. Secondarily, everybody within that organization, they are naturally looking out for their own self-interest. They want promotions, they want higher pay, and that sort of thing. So they're going to make decisions not on the goal of the organization, but largely within their own self-interest. Third, and this is kind of the thing that the big one, is that once there's inertia, once there's momentum behind the social organization, there becomes a group that controls that social organization that becomes, in quotes, a vested interest. And that vested interest likes the status quo and the way that everything is set up because obviously they benefit from it, so they become resistive to changing anything about what's going on because that would take the resources away from themselves.
Yep.
Yes.
So what he's saying here is their own existence becomes bigger than their purpose. Exactly.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. He always puts things in such a great way. So now his argument here, and that description right there that we just gave, if you want to switch us back to video, that description that we just gave, he says...
Just real quick, this book is actually a pretty quick read.
It's only like 400 pages. Yeah.
Oh my God, it's another tragedy and hope. But no, it's absolutely not. It's like a very quick read. And yeah, maybe it has 400 pages, but it's like much larger letters.
Yeah, much larger letters and smaller pages than Tragedy and Hope. That's right. What the central premise behind Quigley, basically what he's doing, Quigley was a biochemist major for like 3 years before he switched over to history. And his whole idea is, how do I apply scientific principles to history? And this is his scientific principle, or at least his hypothesis, is that all social organizations have a natural tendency to institutionalize, and that this is a natural process and is 100% predictable. Right. And so when he says tragedy and hope in his book, the tragedy is that this is the way that things go, but the hope is that this is not deterministic. If we could identify it and say, hey, this is what's going on, we can change it.
Yeah. So we just went through an example of a military instrument, right? So then there's social instruments. There's all kinds of instruments, but one instrument that's critical, or one type of instrument that's critical to civilization, according to Quigley, is the instrument of expansion.
Right. This is a defining feature of a civilization.
So there's military, this, that, but the defining instrument is the instrument of expansion, without which there is no civilization. And what is the instrument of expansion? Well, we just explained. There has to be a surplus accumulation, there has to be invention, and there has to be investment. And the surplus accumulation just means that some people have more than others, so they
and they have more than their immediate needs.
And more than they need to consume, so they can hire people into areas where that do not fulfill immediate consumption needs, such as building new machinery, new devices, etc. In today's world, obviously, computer software and all that stuff. And so then obviously there has to be people who choose to take that surplus and put it to use
usefully. Yes,
invest it, and then there has to be research and development, I guess we would call it today, but there has to be inventiveness. There has to be the idea to do something to begin with, because without that there's no investment. And even if I wanted to invest, if nobody wanted to work, then I don't have a surplus. I can't build the invention. So
right.
So this is also interesting. It kind of gives you um, I mean, it gives you the insight that capitalism requires a constant mismatch in people's wealth. There always has to be people struggling to obtain something. Seems to work like a virus, he says. But yeah,
What?
so that's the instrument of expansion
Well,
broadly.
and then let's talk about the institutionalization of that instrument broadly.
Well,
So
right. So this is what I was just getting to. So we just explained how instruments become institutionalized over time, and that same thing applies to the instrument of expansion. So actually, we should probably go through some examples of instruments of expansion.
well, I mean,
throughout
let's
history.
go with the same Sumerian example that I started off with. So,
Right.
so
Sumerian,
yep.
the instrument of expansion was in the religious realm, in this six-fold gradient of culture. The priesthood accumulated the surpluses and started deploying the surpluses to hire people to build, bridges, roads, dams, whatever.
Infrastructure that the entire society benefits from.
Right, right.
Well, theoretically, I mean, there's
And-
slaves and stuff, but I mean, you get the picture.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So in Western civilization, the instrument of expansion was initially feudalism, and then it turned to capitalism all the way through today. But it went through successive different stages of capitalism, which we will get into.
Well, but let's talk about the
later shortly.
institutionalization in Sumeria first. So that was the
Okay.
instrument of expansion. What did it look like once it institutionalized? Oh, okay. I'll take it. At first the priesthood is collecting the surplus. Whether nefarious or immoral means or not doesn't matter for the sake of this conversation. And then they reinvest it into public works that the entire society can benefit from, and therefore become more wealthier, and therefore expand. This is where the age of expansion comes into play. When the instrument becomes institutionalized, that organization, in this case the religious organization, once it accumulates a surplus, instead of spending it on things that benefit the society, they spend it on themselves. We're going to build ziggurats. We're going to have crazy parties. We're going to have 40 slaves each. All this stuff on personal aggrandizement instead of purveying it into the society. And what happens is, once the speed of growth of the society starts to slow down, this is officially when Carol Quigley says we enter the age of conflict, because the instrument of expansion is no longer serving the people. And what's interesting here, however, is the people are still paying for it, right? So the people are still paying for this instrument of expansion. I mean, easy way to think of this is, you pay your taxes, they build roads, and then suddenly they're not building roads anymore. They're absconding with the taxes somewhere else, and you're going, well, I'm still paying for it, right? So as more and more resources get eaten up for personal aggrandizement instead of what the people had originally expected it to pay for, society, the civilization, typically deals with this by going to war. This is where the age of conflict comes in. They can say, okay, we can get resources by stealing it from our neighbors, and we can, hire all these people that suddenly don't have the resources that they need, where A, we can give them a job, and B, we can hopefully kill some of them. so we don't have to feed them anymore. And this is how we start marching down the stages of civilization. And again, Quigley's argument that an instrument will naturally institutionalize. This is what it looks like when it applies to the most important instrument of a civilization, which is the instrument of expansion.
Right. So you just gave the example of the priesthood in Sumeria. Then other civilizations started using different instruments within culture to accumulate surpluses. In the feudal era, it was the
knights with their
knights.
self-sufficient manners, right? They would accumulate a surplus from their serfs. And then they were able to trade luxury goods with utilizing their accumulated surpluses.
Mm-hmm. That came later on. So we have this instrument of expansion. Today, it's financial capitalism, by the way. or as I would actually call it, almost I think turning into full-on data capitalism. But we just stick with financial
This is
capitalism.
another conversation we've had before. Yes.
Expansion is inevitable, therefore all that comes with it. Right.
So just to move things along here, because we're trying to get to Peter Zehan.
Right.
So all civilizations have followed this graph that Quigley has described, with two exceptions. The first one is the Hittites, that they were somewhere in the phase of somewhere in stage 3, and they suddenly vanish off the face of the earth, and it's a great mystery for history students because they can't figure out why.
The sea peoples.
The second is Western civilization. And we have the opposite situation where each time that we have gone into the conflict zone and we're on the verge of universal empire, a new instrument of expansion gets developed, which makes the old one irrelevant, and a new age of expansion can start. And so if you've got, I can never remember the guy who was the first universal empire in Western civilization. Was it Charlemagne or Clovis? One of these guys in like the 12th century?
The first universal empire would have been under the Brits under feudalism.
Right. I can't remember the name of the king that attempted it. So basically,
well, it wouldn't be Charlemagne. It would be a British king, Charles.
Oh yeah, Charlemagne was a Holy Roman Emperor, right? Yeah, I can't.
So Charlemagne falls in this period of gestation, and when the expansion begins, he's out. I think basically Charlemagne was actually the Holy Roman Empire and all this stuff.
Whoever it was that I can't remember the name of, William the Conqueror. I think that was it. There's my C, Conqueror.
Yeah.
So William the Conqueror attempts to universal empire-alize the feudal system. However, in the meantime, a new instrument of expansion was formed, which Quigley refers to as commercial capitalism, if I remember correctly, which I think the rough detail is that people have better naval capacity and can start trading by boat. So basically, okay, William the Conqueror, you just won the War of Swords. We just invented muskets. So have fun with that. Is basically what happened. And then as this develops, the next attempt at universal empire was actually Napoleon. And I mean, when you look at him conquering the map, it looks like he almost got it. But what happened in England is the Industrial Revolution started. So basically that's saying, okay, Napoleon, you just won the War of Muskets. Great. We just invented machine guns. Not literally at this point. But we have industrial revolution capacity where we could pump stuff out faster than you could deal with anything in your system. And so then the society becomes industrialized. We have a new age of expansion. This culminates with Hitler almost getting, at least according to Quigley, attempting to do a universal empire. He loses, and then this is where we started the conversation when we go, okay, he loses in 1945. 20 years later, Quigley writes his last book, or that we have access to, in 1968, which isn't a whole lot of time to figure out what's going on. Now where are we at?
Right. And so we went from feudalism through commercial capitalism to industrial capitalism in the 1700s and 1800s to monopoly capitalism in the early 1900s. Actually,
you skipped one.
Sorry, to financial capitalism and then monopoly capitalism in the early 1900s. And then we have World War II, and now we're here. And what's the system we're under now? Quigley calls it the pluralist society.
But he never gives a really clear description of what that means.
Right. And Peter Zehan picks up there, so I think it's a nice segue to his
switch us back to video. So Peter Zehan starts his story, at least as I understand it, that at the end of World War II, the U.S. was basically the last man standing in any sort of industrial capacity. And we had this new specter on the horizon of the Soviet Union. And the U.S. made a deal that's kind of unique in history, which is to say, hey, we're the last power here, particularly we're the last power that has any sort of naval projection. Hey, rest of the world, we'll make you a deal. We will agree to patrol the oceans of the world if you agree to let us set your foreign policy so we can contain the Soviet Union. And this starts the history of globalism, or this starts the trajectory of globalism, which is to say the whole world being able to trade with each other safely, right? Because before this, if you had your boat in the wrong spot trying to trade, a neighboring country could just take it, and there wasn't a whole lot you could do about it other than like go into war. And so now that the U.S. is the last man standing, it's the only place that has any sort of naval projection. It can say, okay, we can protect the entire world's oceans and control the whole world's oceans, so you guys can trade. And Peter Zeihan even makes an interesting note here. Is he's like, people refer to the American empire. This isn't really an empire in traditional terms. In traditional terms, if we look at, say, the British Empire, they had the naval projection to benefit Britain. Whereas the goal of the U.S. naval projection isn't economic. It's political and military, which is to contain the Soviet Union. And what happens is we create a system on the world stage where suddenly certain areas of the world that aren't really capable of being self-sufficient, say places in the Middle East or places in Africa or whatever, but they do have access to, say, one raw resource like oil or wood or gold or diamonds, something like this, right? Is they can now import everything that they need from the rest of the world as long as they're able to export this one raw resource. And the only reason that they're able to do this is because the United States is patrolling the world's oceans and keeping them safe. Now, fast forward to, 1991 or whatever it is, Soviet Union's not a thing anymore. And the United States, the people of the United States, are really getting sick of the idea of patrolling the oceans of the world. And since then, we've been phasing out our foreign policy, particularly under Trump. And according to Peter Zeihan, Biden is just doubling down on this foreign policy. That, okay, we're not interested in patrolling the oceans anymore. So instead of having a Navy that we could project with, like, say, 800 destroyers. I think Peter Zeihan said in order for us to patrol the oceans, we would need 800 destroyers. We have focused more on aircraft carriers, which are great for military conquest and military defense. I mean, you could knock a country out with aircraft carriers, but you can't patrol the oceans because they can't be everywhere at once. So we're in this phase where now that the United States is backing off from patrolling the oceans, we're looking at a pre-World War II situation where, okay, there's regional blocks, and maybe one country looks at another country and says, I'm going to steal the stuff on your boat, right? Right? And now, what are the consequences of this? Well, let's fold that over with demographics. So we just kind of talked about a really rough geopolitical situation, right? Let's fold that over with demographics. So after World War II, we've got the baby boomer generation that more or less happened everywhere on Earth. There's exceptions, but more or less happened everywhere on Earth where we have this huge population bubble.
Which is due to industrialization, according to Zeihan. I mean, I'm reading his book now, and he goes into a little more detail. He talks about how the phenomenon of industrialization in the 1700s, 1800s, and the urbanization has increased lifespans. And when you increase the lifespan of the population through better hygiene, all these things, then you're going to have population growth. I mean, your population is gonna it's going to get bigger because there's more people
Not dying. Yeah, there's more people
not
not dying. Yes.
So then there's a phase where those people still have sufficient children, but as urbanization moves on, these people who live longer now have fewer children. So now you have a situation where you have population looks like it's growing and growing and growing, but at the same time, the people who are supposed to have children have fewer and fewer children. So there's going to come a hard cut at one point where now these children that could have been born throughout all this period where it looked like population was growing, they haven't been born, and the older generation is retiring, and now we don't have enough young people in most places in the world. So that's the demographic scenario that he talks about, which is by necessity a phenomenon of industrialization.
Well, and then he also argues that this is happening right now. Like the apex of the boomer bubble moving through where we're going to have more retirees than boomers working is happening right this second.
This year or last year or so, where the majority of boomers have gone into retirement, and what comes with that is worker shortages because most countries in the world don't have enough millennials, don't have enough Gen Zers. The U.S.
Ironically
also
does.
Well, the U.S.
Yeah, go ahead.
The U.S. is much better off than these other countries, according to Zehan. Demographically, I mean, in almost every dimension of geopolitics and culture, the U.S. is better off than the rest of the world at this very moment, because as the world is going to start fragmenting again. The U.S. has already started with the Trump administration in the 2010s, has begun reindustrializing, according to Zehan, heavily, actually.
Well,
and this is going to be a trend.
I was going to say, before we talk about that, I think it's worth, because I think this is a new way of thinking for a lot of people. I think we should go over roughly the U.S., like you're doing now, Russia and China and possibly Germany as the big players on Earth that are about to view very, very rapid change, and only one of those four looks good. The U.S. is the only one that looks good. So we're here. Yeah. Well, and we'll talk about
maybe
that.
Maybe two, by the way.
What's the second one?
He says Russia could.
Oh, okay. Okay.
He says Russia could have an opportunity. But yeah. Anyway.
Well, let's start with Russia.
Germany.
We got the whole Ukraine war thing going on, right? So Russia, if you look at their population bubble, so as Nima was mentioning, in the United States, even though there's more boomers and millennials and Gen Z, there still are a lot of millennials. The boomers here did have significant numbers of children. In most of the other countries on Earth, they didn't. And so when you look at something like Russia, when you look at the population profile of Russia, it looks like we're moving through this boomer bubble. And one of the reasons that Peter Zehan claims that the Ukraine war is happening right now is because this is literally the last chance where there's enough fighting age males in Russia that they could actually have a war, because after this, there literally won't be enough people in the country to have an army to fight a war. And so that's problem number one with Russia, is they have this demographic time bomb that's happening in real time right now. The second problem is Russia's kind of a glorified gas station, where their biggest export that they have, the biggest thing that they have going for them is oil and natural gas. And that if a large part of that oil and natural gas comes from areas that are in permafrost. So when Russia is invading the Ukraine, and it's doing so for geopolitical reasons. Sorry, I'll get back to oil in a second. It's doing so for geopolitical reasons, where Russia sees this as a matter of life and death. And according to Peter Zehan, they're not really wrong about that, because Russia's so flat, it's pretty indefensible. And historically, the way Russia has dealt with it is that they've expanded to choke points. Whether that's the Georgia and Armenia where you have the little strait in between the two seas, or the mountains in Eastern Europe, or wherever, right? Is you expand to these choke points where if there was an invasion that were to come, you could stop it. Now, pre-Soviet Union, they had all these choke points either directly in the Soviet Union or in the buffer fringe of the Eastern European countries that were technically their own countries, but really had to do what the Soviet Union told them to do, right? They lost all that, and Putin. Again, reported Peter Zahan, this is one of his biggest worries, is getting that space back. And not only do they need to get that space back, when they look at something like the Ukraine, Russia literally needs the people in the Ukraine. Because they've got this population time bomb, demographic time bomb that's going off right now. They literally need the population in the Ukraine. And Peter Zahan has further pointed this out, is that none of the choke points that I just described are in the Ukraine. They're beyond the Ukraine. So it's complete. A, he completely predicted that the Ukraine invasion was going to happen. And B, his next prediction is they're not going to stop. Because I believe Moldova has one of the choke points, and some Latvia or whatever, the other choke points there. And what, according to Peter,
well, it's interesting because Moldova also has its own little Russian republic.
Oh yeah,
that is rarely talked about, Transnistria. But
they can theoretically do the same thing. Russia could do the same thing of look at this independent country of Russians. Yes.
Right. They could do the same model. But this is a map here. I think Peter Zahan used this map also, which I don't know if it's a good illustration, but it kind of first of all, it gives you a sense of how much arable land is there really in Russia.
It's not a lot.
It's
or I should say, it is a lot, but it's spread out in a way that makes it really difficult to access.
Well, right.
Yes.
And, I don't really know how, what kind of climates are we talking about in these?
Right. That's touching the Arctic Ocean. Yes.
Right. But so if you look at Ukraine, it's all green. It's like if you think Russia is this giant country and Ukraine is this small little country, why are the Russians so interested in it? Well, if you look at it in terms of arable land, I mean, all of Ukraine is green, so it's all part of the Russian wheat belt, and it's a significant chunk of it. I mean, it's maybe like a fifth or fourth of all of what Russia
and it's not in a tundra zone.
Right. And then also what is important about Ukraine geopolitically is the fact that if Ukraine is handed over to NATO, this is all this easily invaded basically from the West.
It's impossible to have a choke point at that point if Ukraine
Whereas
goes
here you have to protect this
choke points.
What's that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're mountain ranges or whatever. They have one road that comes through them or something like that.
Right. And he talks about gaps here. So I guess Polish Gap, Baltic Sea, Bessarabian Gap. So I guess these are points where people could still come in, but they obviously want to keep those small.
Right. Right. So here is another fascinating thing. So apparently Russia invades the Ukraine, and they bungled it up so badly. They bungled it up so badly that the American generals are looking over at them going, Russia doesn't know how to fight a modern war. And after they shook their heads stunned, they realized, wait a minute, if we get in a ground war with Russia, we're going to kick their asses. And then they went, wait a minute, if we're just going to steamroll them, that means the only option Russia has is nukes. And so, again, repeating Peter Zahan here, right, is that one of the reasons that the United States and the West in general is freaking out so hard about the Ukraine is they say if Russia takes the Ukraine, and they understand that that's not their stopping point, they're going to keep going, and at some point they go to they hit a NATO country. Now it's NATO versus Russia on a ground war. NATO recognizes that they're going to steamroll Russia based on what they just saw, and that Russia's only option out at that point is nukes. They're like, in order for us to avoid a nuclear war, this can't go beyond the Ukraine. Which, when I first heard that, by the way, I was actually kind of shocked, because I was really shocked, actually, because I'm like, that's a pretty good reason for supporting the Ukraine. And if that's a pretty good reason for supporting the Ukraine, why are we getting all this crazy fucking propaganda about how glorious the Ukraine is and how evil Russia is, and you're not allowed to you'll get banned off of YouTube or whatever. I don't think we're streaming on YouTube. Hopefully they don't ban us. But people are getting censored left and right if they questioned Ukraine, the Ukrainian moral superiority at the beginning. And which led me to go, okay, well, the media is telling me to think this, so I should think the opposite. But now I hear this, and I'm like, actually, that's kind of a reasonable argument.
We need to.
What's that?
So we need to replace You need to replace the logo behind you with the Ukraine flag. Still,
oh yeah, I'm sorry.
So we don't get booted off of YouTube.
Good point.
Yeah.
So anyway,
we'll get to it. We'll get to it.
So that's kind of the current drama surrounding Ukraine, and it's a fresh perspective, and I'm actually kind of frustrated.
Yeah. So that's Russia.
Yeah.
So,
well, I do want to add this at the end.
Didn't necessarily even
is that I feel like if our propaganda network just told us that, like they'd get a little bit more support instead of just ramming it down. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Go ahead. That's Russia.
Yeah. So that's so again, big picture is because of the demographic decline, because of the demographic situation born out of industrialization. Countries are going to have worker shortages, and with that shortages of inflation, and with that they're going to start moving in industry back into their own countries. The U.S. has a head start with that, and all over the world, this is what Zehan identifies as the current trend, and he calls it the end of the order. He keeps on referring to 1945 through 2015 as the order. But it's synonymous with globalism, I guess part of it was Bretton Woods order. But big picture is the industry moving back into the big countries of the world. And
so we're not outsourcing to China, for example.
Right, so not outsourcing to countries that could be a security risk. And also he says in this book that something's going to blow off somewhere in either Russia or the Middle East or in East Asia, and that will lead to the unraveling of this order. And I think that's exactly... And he wrote that right before February, the February invasion of Ukraine earlier this year. So it has some good predictive power, what he wrote there. But if that's not what we're seeing right now, I don't know what is. I mean, the whole world is now freaking out kind of about things that they used to take for granted. And that's exactly the message of Zehan's book and his analysis is nothing is going to be the way it used to be. A lot of things that we took for granted, we're not going to be able to access anymore as this order changes.
I do want to finish one more thing on Russia. Sorry, because I started with oil. I think this is super important. Is that, and this is the dire situation Russia is looking at, is the reason I want to point this out, is they have oil that gets drawn up out of a permafrost zone. And due to the fact that it's a permafrost zone, the flow cannot be stopped. If the flow stops, the oil will coagulate with the water, and it will bust the pipes. And Peter Zehan points out that the last time that this happened is when the Soviet Union fell, and people stopped working, and the things busted up. And he said it has taken them 30 years to replace it, and that was with the help of Western oil industry. Now with all these sanctions that are happening all over Russia, what's happening is they're running into a situation where there may not be enough demand for them to continue pumping that oil out. And if it breaks, it's done. And what we're looking at, here's a terrifying prediction, right? So all these sanctions have been going on Russia. A new sanction occurs January 1st in 4 days, 5 days, is that there will be a new sanction on insurance. Western companies will no longer be allowed to insure ships with Russian cargo, which includes Russian oil tankers. And this goes back to the privateering and piracy that I talked about earlier, is once that happens, it's going to take one country, and it could be like Latvia or something, to go up and go, you know what? This tanker's ours. We're taking everything. And Russia, he pointed out, has the ability to self-insure $5 billion. That's nothing.
Wait,
right?
He thinks Latvia is going to take a Russian tanker?
No, he said, for example, Latvia could.
Wait, no, but I mean, I'm just like...
Because Latvia has a vendetta. Latvia is pissed off at Russia, and they could do it knowing that these are going to be the results.
Latvia is also absolutely terrified of Russia, so... I would doubt that they would go that far.
Okay, but the point wasn't Latvia. The point is whoever it is, it could be a small player like that could set off the chain of events, because if one of these ships gets hijacked by anybody, and then the insurance stops, that means the boats don't go out. If the boats stop going out, there's no place to pump the new oil. And if there's no place to pump the new oil, you shut it off, it breaks, and the infrastructure's done. And then that's the main resource of Russia, is being able to pump that oil. So they are in a fucking pickle right now.
Okay.
Yes, okay, enough of Russia.
So, by the way, we have a comment. What I see is the USA crushing Europe and transferring many of the German industry to the USA.
Yeah, let's talk about Germany.
So we'll get to that.
He said that. Okay.
So, I mean, if we want to close it off about Russia, I could just read a quick paragraph from the book where he talks about Russia. While everything in Russia is and always has been done in its own peculiar way, it is undeniable that Russia was part of the first big batch of countries to industrialize, after the Brits and on a similar time frame to the Germans. The intertwined demographic and industrialization stories of the Russians and Germans, in fact, have been the story of Europe from the early 1800s right up to the current day. But whereas the Germans used the American-led order to make a quantum leap up the value-added scale and turn their economy from an industrialized one into a more export-oriented, technocratic structure, the Soviet Union was the order's target and so could do none of that. Instead, the Soviets went down the road of command-driven communism. Outside of the military realm, Russia simply could not keep up with the technological dynamism of the American-led world. As the years stacked up into decades, the Soviet economy plateaued in terms of sophistication, and nearly all economic growth in the 60s and 70s wasn't from technology or productivity, but instead from an expansion of the working-age population. More inputs, more outputs. To believe the Soviet Union would continue to function over the long haul, you had to believe that the Soviet population would continue growing, and that just wasn't in the cards. Between devastation and the world wars, Stalin's tender urbanization and collectivization efforts, broad-scale mismanagement under Khrushchev, and organizational stagnation under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union stopped generating sufficient numbers of new workers. By 1980, the demographic pipeline was already running dry, and then the bottom fell out. The trauma of the Soviet collapse was economic, cultural, political, strategic, and demographic. Between 1986 and 1994, the birth rate halved, while the death rate nearly doubled. Russia today is deindustrializing at the same time its population is collapsing. Dark? Yes, but Russia is probably one of the best case scenarios for much of the industrialized world. Russia, after all, at least has ample capacity at home to feed and fuel itself, in addition to sufficient nuclear weapons to make any would-be aggressor stop and think. a few dozen times before launching an assault. In a world of constrained trade and capital, one could be in significantly more dire straits than still having strategic depth plus reasonably reliable food, fuel, and electricity. But the gold standard in terms of preparing for a post-growth life is elsewhere. And then he goes into Japan. Just real quick, he says Japan has dealt with the post-growth malaise phenomenon by desourcing, which means you set up factories abroad and you hire people from abroad and you sell to those people abroad. And the money comes back home, I guess, to support your retirees or whatever.
Right.
So whatever. So Russia still at least has the resources and the military, the nukes to be some sort of self-sufficient.
Right.
I guess that's all for Russia.
As opposed to Germany. I think it's a good segue to Germany because what's happening in Russia is really affecting Germany right now.
Right. So Germany has been for the longest time export dependent and needs to export goods to the U.S. and doesn't have the natural resources to be self-sufficient and doesn't have the demographic structure, first and foremost, to be self-sufficient. So Zehan's outlook for Germany and China is incredibly dire. I don't know what exactly it's going to look like or whatever, but he says that they are deindustrializing, and this is their last decade, this or the next 2 decades maybe, their last 2 decades of them being an industrially relevant country.
Well, and then
with China.
Well, but before we move on to China, I do want to say this about Germany. What's happened recently because of the Ukraine war and the sanctions is Peter Zehan has pointed out that the entire basis of the German economy is being able to get cheap natural gas and petroleum from Russia because of their industry, which is fundamentally a chemical, and then what the hell's the word I want? Engineering industry. They build a lot of stuff, right? Is all the base resource for that is that natural gas and petroleum. Those are the base chemicals that they make everything else out of. So if the price of that suddenly skyrockets or they can't get access to it, the entire German industrialization network collapses. Now, when you add on to the fact the demographic situation, the baby boomers in Germany did not have kids like they did here in the United States. Germany is up a creek without a paddle right now. And that
is, by the way, that applies to almost all countries that are not the United States. Their boomers didn't have as many children as the U.S. did because the U.S. was, after the war, everything was in rubble, and the U.S. was,
last man standing. Yeah,
they didn't have bombs falling on their cities, etc. So yeah, that's why.
And to the point of the viewer here, Zamorano, that he sees the industrialization coming here instead of Germany. Well, here instead of Germany and instead of China, which we're going to get into. But as Nima has pointed out, something like 5 years ago or so now, the U.S. has recognized this and has actually started re-industrializing here. Yeah. So yes, completely agree. Nima, China.
Yeah, so
which is
China
bleak. Very bleak. Yes.
China's bonkers because they may well have the lowest growth rate ever recorded anywhere in terms of reproduction rates, like 1.3 or...
No, it's worse than that. So are you getting that from the book? Because
maybe worse than that.
Peter Zehan, when he's doing his talks...
That's from the book, yeah.
The most recent number I heard from one of his talks is 0.79 replacement rate.
Yeah, entirely
Holy
possible.
Shit!
Because China went so China had the first of all the industrialization effects that we talked about, right? Which is urbanization. You have fewer kids when you live in a condo versus on the countryside, and that has led to the same phenomenon as everywhere else. People getting older, living longer, and that made it look as though the population was growing in a healthy manner. But then they had the one-child policy, so they not only did the natural effects of industrialization hit them, but they chose to
intentionally murder, the next generation,
cripple their population size. And so now, China, I don't know when the last census was supposed to be done, but Peter Zeihan talks about how the Chinese government rejected the last census because they couldn't believe what they saw.
They may have overestimated by 100 million.
100
people, is what
million
he's
at
saying.
least at this point, yeah. And so Peter Zeihan says that within the next 20 years or so, he can see China's population dropping to somewhere in the 500 millions.
More than half gone.
Well, yeah.
And let's talk about a few other things about China, because I mean,
Yeah.
like when I say bleak, get ready for this. So in this world order of that's about to collapse, China is completely dependent on exporting stuff to bring money, and importing food and importing oil. One of the things so Russia has going for it, like Nima said, is they got enough food and oil to export it. China doesn't have that.
Yeah.
They need to import food,
China
they need to
doesn't.
import oil, and fertilizer is such a huge deal over there because Peter Zeihan pointed this out. They don't really have soil like the way that we have soil.
Yeah.
So without
Yeah.
fertilizer,
Yeah.
they really can't grow enough food. And because of the whole global supply chain cracking, if they don't have food, or if the food and oil slows down, their whole system starts to collapse. And furthermore, they don't have any naval projection. This blew my mind. As Peter Zeihan pointed out, is that in optimal conditions, China has about 1,500 miles of naval projection. And he said that's assuming nobody's shooting at them. He said if somebody's shooting at them, they probably got about 350 miles. And their aircraft carriers, they have two. One used to be a cruise ship, and the other one was modeled off the one that used to be a cruise ship. Like, it's a joke compared to what the United States has. And so...
Yeah, that's why he also doesn't think they're going to attack Taiwan for that reason.
Well, for other reasons as well, but yes, that. So as these global networks are crumbling, they don't have... global... what's the word I want? Distribution networks are crumbling. They don't have the naval capacity to enforce them happening, and they are completely dependent on them, both on their imports because they need that for the stuff to live, and both on their exports because they need that for the damn money. And that now that the U.S. in particular is bringing the industry home and pulling it out of China, they're on this tipping point. Now add that into that one more thing, that Xi. I don't know if he has this in the book yet because this is a little more recent. Is that apparently Xi, according to Peter Zeihan, has acquired more power and more cult of personality than Mao Zedong. I have a hard time understanding or believing that, but I mean the guy knows better than I do, so I'll take his word for it at the moment. So Xi has so efficiently purged the system, and we just saw him purge the president on live TV openly, right? I guess that was the person who had supported him in the purges before that, and so what a final cap of power to say, okay, you're the last person I know that knows how to purge anybody within my sphere, you're out. And so what's happened is that the Chinese government, the CCP, has split into two factions. The first faction is the Xi zealots, that they've completely taken over the cult of personality of Xi, and they're trying to do what they think Xi wants them to do. And the example that he always gives is like they're decontaminating airplane runways for COVID after an airplane takes on and off. Like, that's totally retarded. And the other faction are the people going, I don't want to attract Xi's attention because he shoots the messenger if they bring bad news. What's this you pulled up? Oh, I can't read the top. Was that Xi Jinping's cult of Xi Jinping's cult of personality? There it is on Wikipedia. So, because if you do something bad, Xi shoots you. If you do something good, you made Xi look bad, so he shoots you. So the entire apparatus of the people who aren't the zealots are afraid to do anything unless specifically told, because they're afraid of arousing the ire of Xi. And because Xi, even if he was this brilliant mastermind, he can't micromanage a billion people. This means that the administrative capacity of China has suddenly become unable to respond to changes. On top of all this other crazy shit that's happening.
Exactly. China has become so inert, I guess, because nobody even wants to suggest anything to Xi, because they're just scared about what he'll do to them.
Right.
If he doesn't like the suggestion.
Well,
so it's just a lot of people are just playing it safe in the Chinese establishment, and they'd rather not approach him with anything. And the things they do, they just go with what seems to have worked so far. So I think that may explain these strange lockdowns that they keep doing now.
Right, because they're trying to do what they think Xi wants, or they're just following the policy that's already there. They're going, hey, I'm not rocking the boat.
Right.
And here's this was fascinating. Peter Zahan pointed out. So remember those blackouts that got reported in China, like back in spring? Apparently, Xi didn't learn about them until September when he read about it in a newspaper. Nobody told him because they're too afraid to bring him bad news. That's how fucked up the current administration is. The current administrative capacity is in China.
Yeah.
So, Peter Zahan has pointed this out that he's like, yeah, I'm totally not afraid of China becoming a world power. Like they are on their way out. It's imploding in China.
Yeah, his analysis is pretty solid, I think. We have some new comments. That was my point. Now add Germany dependency on Russian gas, plus the American Build Back Better that is supposed to incentivize companies, including foreign green jobs for the future. I believe she is top dog of all Chinese dictators. Technology makes a difference.
Yeah, I believe that.
So the green jobs thing is something that Europe is suddenly really concerned about, right? So America, the Build Back Better bill, or one of these recent bills, subsidizes American EV companies or American car companies to incentivize EV production. And the European government, the European Commission has a problem with this because they don't do that, I guess, to the extent that the US does. And they're really worried about US car companies now gaining a significant competitive advantage in the European market because of these subsidies. Yeah, so that's what he was, so he says exactly. So that's what he was referring to. Which is kind of, I found it weird. I thought the green thing is the thing we're all supposed to do, and yay, we're going to stop the weather from changing, and all the efforts in the world are warranted and justified. But when it comes to plain numbers, suddenly they have a problem with that in Europe.
Right.
And yes, she is obviously the top of all Chinese dictators. Technology makes he has. Like, no Chinese dictator has ever had this kind of technocratic society. So if you're like a psycho who wants to dominate an Asian country, perfect setup for
setup. So we could go country by country and start breaking stuff down, but I don't want to go that detailed for the show. I think these 4 players are the big ones.
Well, what will be interesting, I think, is to quickly recap why the U.S. has such advantages against almost everyone else in this new world, in this fragmented, fracturing order.
I think I could do it pretty quickly. First, we have a food surplus. We actually export food, and we export seed crop. I learned this recently. Met some people down in Oregon. They have a farm. They grow seed crop to sell to Asia because they don't have enough space to grow food and grow seeds for the next year. So in the United States, we literally grow the seeds for other countries to plant their crops.
The United States is an agricultural powerhouse, unlike any other country in the world. The U.S. has so much arable land; it's very unique.
Second
regard.
uniqueness is we have a ton of oil, we got a ton of natural gas, and with the shale extraction technology getting better and better, that we're getting access to huger and huger oil reserves that are there but that we'd never had access to. Third, our security level is like unreal in the sense that we've got oceans on both sides of us and peaceful neighbors to the north and south. Like, Europe doesn't enjoy that sort of situation, right? Fourth, I didn't recognize this one. We have the Mississippi River. I never knew how big of a deal the Mississippi River is because I'm sure anybody watched this, you've seen a map of like all the tributaries of the Mississippi River. It covers like 2/3 of the freaking country, right? Almost the entire thing is navigable. Like, the Nile's not like that. The Amazon's not like that. The other massive rivers of the world, they don't have that same level of navigability. Like, you know, at some point there's some huge waterfall or something, you're like, I can't get up that. So if you compare water transport to ground transport, presuming the roads and infrastructure are already in place for the trucks, water is 1/13 the price of ground. And the United States is in a unique position where 2/3 of the country is accessible by waterways. No other country on earth has that.
Yeah. Yeah, so he talks a lot about the strategic advantages, the economic advantages you have by having a large river network in your country. This is part of his analysis. This is part of his observations process.
And then if you add on to that the demographics, so we essentially, there's a couple countries like us, like New Zealand, but we essentially have the best demographics over every other country on Earth.
Yes.
In terms of the replacement population that's going to replace the boomers.
Another thing I found interesting is he says that the U.S. has actually been pretty moderate in its pace of industrialization compared to all the other countries, compared to especially the early industrializers, Great Britain, and then even Germany afterwards. They rammed it through, but the U.S. countryside wasn't even industrialized up until 1960. So the U.S., this is a pattern, and this is a common thing in the U.S., where for a long period, things don't really happen, and then suddenly we catch up. Mm-hmm. But we take our time. We don't let the trend of the world dominate our industrialization the way it has happened in other countries. And that may have also helped the demographics to some extent adjust to this change. But then obviously, yes, we had we were the last man standing after World War II. And that has allowed the boomers in the U.S. to have to have lots of children. And that's why the U.S. has the largest millennial population in the world, if I understand that correctly. So I'll just go through what he lists here in the book.
Sure.
The where Americans have an edge. Number one, geography. Like you already said, the United States has more high-quality temperate zone arable farmland than any other country. The U.S. has more land suitable for habitation. And then, like you said, moving things around on water costs 1/12 of that of moving them on land. So that is an advantage in terms of the geography. Friendly neighbors to the north and to the south. And obviously, especially, what I thought was interesting, he talks about Mexico.
Yes.
And, the American conservatives' favorite pastime is complaining about what's going on at the southern border. Oh my God, we don't have a country because they can just walk in here. Look at them. They're just, what kind of country is that? But he says the southern border is absolutely not a threat to the United States, militarily, geostrategically. It's actually a super secure border. And he said the fact that people can just in a disorganized fashion run through it here or there, that's a testament to how hard it is to organize any kind of governmental action in that, or any kind of governmental activity in that area. So for a military to march through the desert and mountains and make it into the U.S. intact and to be any kind of danger, he says is impossible. militarily. It's not going to happen. And he also says that the Trump administration's efforts to build a border wall along Mexico
Made it worse.
has expanded the network of roads around the border wall, which actually made it easier.
So once they get across the border, there's a road that they could just walk on to get in. Nima, you froze up.
Two, the boomers and the millennials, as we just said. The U.S. has more boomers and millennials. The boomers had more children, so we have more millennials in the workforce than any other country, which is mentions as well. They are very different. They're not exactly team workers, so it remains to be seen where the Zoomers fall in here. And then part three, the American culture. America is a settler state. The whole country speaks one language, and America doesn't have a hard time integrating people because that's what the
practice
country
doing. Yes,
is used to. So the U.S. government was expressly not designed to serve the interest of any specific ethnicity. Even adherents of critical race theory fully admit that the politically and economically dominant group in the United States, white Caucasians, are themselves a blend of people of English, German, Irish, Italian, French, Polish, Scottish, Dutch, Norwegian, Swedish, and Russian descent in that order. Then, number 4, he says Mexico. While everyone all over the world is going to have problems sourcing cheap labor and cheap goods from somewhere, we're not going to have that problem because we have Mexico.
Basically, we're going to be able to replace China with Mexico.
Yes.
And it's going to be cheaper because it's right there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's ridiculous. And so these are the big 4 items that he brings up. But yeah, definitely that's going to be an advantage to the United States to have Mexico right down there.
We got another question here, but Nima, I do have another call I got to jump on here. And I'll read the questions. Opinion on the BRICS, which is getting bigger by the day, with Argentina, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman seems to be pivoting Russia. That is a very complex question that will if we dive into that, we're going to be here for a while.
Tuned.
Yeah. But great question. So I guess just trying to tie, we started off with Carol Quigley kind of laying some groundwork, and we say, okay, here's this Peter Zeihan guy who he's not speaking the specific language that Quigley comes up with, but we really see him answering similar questions where we say, okay, I think he's described very well this question mark that Carol Quigley leaves on what's going on after World War II. And then we've got a very specific situation of that's about to crumble. And we're not entirely sure what we're going to get out of it, but things in general look good for the United States.
Right. So then what about the BRICS, which are getting bigger and all this? That remains to be seen, but as an American, if you live in the US, I think the most interesting takeaway is the reindustrialization and the dominant position that the US is going to be in from here on. And the population growth, by the way, that's going to happen in the US, and the population decline in all the other countries. I think it's hard to imagine right now what an incredibly advantageous position the United States is going to find itself in over the next 10 to 20 years.
Right, and especially compared to,
actually, literally over the next 10 years, starting now.
And then comparing that to literally like all these places, say in Africa or some part of Indonesia or something, right? Where all these places have experienced incredible population growth because they've had access to this free trade network that's been safeguarded by the United States worldwide. If that suddenly gets shut off and they're not able to exchange their one or two raw resources for the industrialized goods and products of the world, suddenly they don't have the ability to support that population base anymore. I mean, in a lot of places, it's looking bad. It looks really bad, but not here.
So he asked about BRICS, right? So what's part of BRICS? One part of BRICS is China, right?
We already talked about that.
Covered China. It's going to be really bad. China's going to be looking really bad. I think the S in BRICS is for South Africa, so I don't know what
I don't know.
South
I
Africa.
can't
The
comment
I
on
is for
South Africa.
India.
India, we
Yeah.
can say something, but
think-
we'll dive into another conversation. We'll just
Right.
plan on having a round 2 on this, Nima.
Right, and then Russia, we did mention Russia. So we actually covered quite a few of those countries, and a lot of them are going to be experiencing not just economic decline, but population decline. I mean, they are going to literally decline in relevance around. You're not going to hear much anymore from some of these countries probably
Right.
at one point because they're just not as relevant as they are at the moment in terms of population size.
Right. Cool. Well, let's cut it there. This has been Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of IridaTV. You can find us at Irida.tv. Just stick a dot right there in between those 2 words. And follow us at the social media of your choice. Tell your friends. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.